Well, good evening. It's time for us to get started, and we are wrapping up our study on the intertestamental period of time tonight. And what we're going to be doing is going back to our lesson on last Wednesday because we didn't get it completed, particularly our study of the Sadducees. But what we're looking at are the people of this particular period of time, noticing some things about these different groups, and we're going to make a number of observations. We have a lot of material to cover tonight. I'm pretty confident that we're not going to get through with it all, but a lot of the information you'll be able to find in that book that we have that was given by Farrell Jenkins. And if you're really interested, you can do your own independent research, and there's a lot of information that is out there in whatever you call it, the webland on the internet. But there's also a lot of good books that have been written about this stuff. So if you're interested in building your library that centers around an intertestamental period of time, I would recommend that you do that. And I could even recommend some books to you about that. Okay, so let's begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll get into our material tonight. Father, we are grateful to you for this opportunity that we have to be together. And we praise you, Father, for the great God that you are and for your great scheme of redemption that has made it possible for all of us to be in a right relationship with you through your Son. And we thank you, Father, that we have the revelation of your mind in the Bible that helps us to be able to know your will for our lives and guides us and directs us. And we pray that you would help us to be good students of it, that we might be diligent in our search for truth, and that as we find the needs where we need to be making in our lives, the changes that we need to make in our lives, that we would have the courage and the fortitude to be able to make those changes so that we might bring our lives into conformity with your will, seeking to be conformed to the image of Jesus. Please bless our time together and be with those of our number who are experiencing difficulties at this time, particularly those who may be struggling with their health. We pray that you would be with them. Please watch over them, help us to be mindful of them and to do the things that we can to be there for them, to be supportive and encouraging to them as they continue in their struggles. Please bless us in our time together tonight. May all the things that we do be done to your name's honor and glory. For we pray in Jesus' name, amen. And I think we do have people joining us on the live stream because the live stream's up this week, so I have to be careful with what I say, so that I make sure that it doesn't come back to haunt me someday. Okay, I want to begin by just simply making an observation that I think it's kind of been made throughout this study, but really hasn't been just articulated in a way that has been, I think, very clear. And so I want to make this as clear as possible as we begin this last lesson. And that is that over the years, there has been this kind of what I think is a common misunderstanding that Judaism, particularly the Judaism of the first century, was kind of like a homogeneous, monolithic sort of a religion that all faithful Jews adhered to. But the fact is that the Judaism of the first century was anything but a uniform religion. And even it was not even a uniform way of living, because the fact is there were multiple Judaisms. And so it would be comparable, I think, at least as far as the beliefs that people might have even in the modern day, to look at Christianity. And when you look at Christianity, you don't look at this monolithic religion. You look at this one religion that people have taken, run with it in all kinds of different directions. And so we have all kinds of different denominations and things of that nature that they disagree with one another. And sometimes they get into conflict with one another over the disagreements that they might have. Well, that's the same thing that I think would have been true of the Jews, particularly in this first century period of time with respect to the Judaisms that did in fact exist. And as we have been pointing out, there were multiple groups that developed within Jewish culture with different ways of thinking that led therefore to different ideas as to what constituted a faithful Jew. And that in turn then led to different types of behaviors, both good and bad. And what it did is it created an environment in which the Jews, who already were experiencing conflict with the Gentiles around them, would oftentimes then find themselves in conflict with one another. And a great many of these different ways of thinking that led to the development of all of these different Judaisms that influenced the world of the New Testament, that is the time in which Jesus lived, and just after that with respect to the development and the growth of the church. With all of those different ways of thinking, you begin to wonder, well, how did that happen? And much of it happened during the intertestamental period of time that we have been studying about. And for this reason, I think it becomes significant as to why we need to be exploring some of the better known and the more influential groups that were known to have existed during New Testament times. And so we started last week by looking at the two primary sects among the Jews, which were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And we spent most of our time with the Pharisees because they are the ones who are the most ubiquitous and most prevalent in the New Testament, particularly in the Gospels. You see them also in the book of Acts, but primarily you see them in the Gospels. And so they are indeed a group of people that we have to know a little bit about in order to be able to appreciate particularly the conflict that Jesus would have had with them. And so we spent time with the Pharisees. We were going to cover the Sadducees, but we ran out of time. We did begin a little bit about them. But tonight what I want to do is to start, just kind of pick it up with the Sadducees, and then we'll look at some of the other groups that are also mentioned, and we'll do the best we can to get through it as we look at each one of these different groups. Okay, so we're going to talk then about the Sadducees, and we already talked a little bit about their origin. And again, I would just simply make the observation that it is recognized that, like the Pharisees, the Sadducees were this distinct political group, this religio-political group that developed during the religious and the political turmoil that characterized the time of the Maccabees, which was in the 2nd century BC. And they were a smaller group than the Pharisees. They had more political power, though. And the reason why was because the Sadducees were the ones who controlled the priesthood. And there are clearly identifiable differences between these two groups. And one of the greatest differences centered in the politics versus the religion. And one man that I had cited, that I quoted last week, a man by the name of Mark Braun, who wrote a book called The Intertestamental, or The Time Between the Testaments, actually, is the title of the book. He made the observation, and I think that this is an important point, and that is that the key question that the first century Jew was often entertaining was, how much may a Jew become a Greek and still be a Jew? And so the very essence of what Pharisaism was all about was separatism, whereas the Sadducees, they believed that in order to be able to accommodate the Gentile world, what they needed to do is to do the best they could to just simply try to get along with them in order for the Sadducees to be able to keep their place and to keep their power. And that started with John Hyrcanus, who was the son of Simon the Maccabee. He was the one who began that initial kind of compromise with the Greeks in order to be able to continue to exercise his political influence in the region of Palestine. And of course, that led to the Hasmonean dynasty, which then eventually led to the Herods, and that's when we get into the New Testament period of time. And we also pointed out that the Pharisees basically represented the middle class. The common man, in other words, the blue collar worker, whereas the Sadducees were the more affluent within the society in which they lived, and they represented the upper class. And these were people who in particular did not want to lose their favored status, and by New Testament times, they were always in fear of some kind of an uprising against Rome, which would endanger their way of living. And that, I believe, is seen clearly in what you see in John chapter 11 in verses 45 through 53, where the high priest at the time is having this debate about what are they going to do with Jesus. And one of the observations he makes is that if in fact we don't do something about this man, then Rome is going to come in and they're going to take our power away from us. And that's really all that they cared about. That's really all that they were concerned about. So the Sadducees were more inclined to maintaining their political power, their social status, as opposed to being anybody who was really founded upon some kind of a religious foundation, something that was strong in their faith. Now, that isn't to say that they weren't religious. It is simply to say that they would have been the religious liberals. That's the way that I think it would be fair to characterize them. And so we are going to be talking about their identifying characteristics a little bit now. And I did ask a question, and this is on question sheet for lesson 12. I asked you to list some of the identifying characteristics of the Sadducees. Now, does anybody want to try to briefly give what you think are some of the identifying characteristics that we need to be, that we do in fact need to be aware of? Okay, then I'll go ahead and give you my assessment of it. And just for the sake of time, I think that may even work out a little bit better. But anyway, the first thing I would point out to you is that although many of the beliefs and many of the beliefs that the Sadducees held to were quite different from the Pharisees, which we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a minute. But what I really want to focus on is the point that I am making is the realm they operated in. And this is one of the greatest differences between these two groups. Because when we're talking about the Pharisees, what was their realm of operation as far as the religion was concerned? What, for lack of a better way of saying it, what institution did they actually capitalize on? In the synagogue, okay. And the synagogues were obviously, they were much more prevalent. They were all over the Mediterranean region at that time. And so therefore, they did in fact have a great influence. Again, they were primarily among the common people, and so they had a great influence by virtue of the fact that there were so many synagogues all over the Mediterranean that they could therefore, they could pass on their beliefs and their understanding of things. The Sadducees, however, were a little bit different because their influence was primarily in the temple. They were of the priestly families, and so therefore that's where their focus was. And so it would limit then their influence primarily to the region of Palestine and especially to the city of Jerusalem. And that's one of the key reasons why it was that the Sadducees were not nearly as influential in propagating their ideas and their ideology as were the Pharisees throughout the Mediterranean region. And so when you finally do turn to the book of Acts, and you see the Apostle Paul, as he's going about his journeys to spread the gospel, he's going into synagogues, and the people he's oftentimes getting confrontation with are the Pharisees, because the Pharisees were the ones who ran the synagogues. He had, at least there is no indication anywhere in the book of Acts, perhaps with the exception of what you find over there in, I think it's around the 22nd chapter of Acts, where he is actually being brought before the Sanhedrin Council, and then there is a mixture of Sadducees and Pharisees. But you don't really see him having any kind of conflict with the Sadducees, and the reason why is because they weren't there. They were primarily in the region of Palestine, and of course Paul was all over the Mediterranean. One of the key areas of their religious beliefs that was very much unlike the Pharisees is the fact that these were a people who refused to accept the traditions of the elders as being authoritative. And of course that obviously would create problems between them and the Pharisees. Now there's one other observation that I want to make that I think is also important to understand, which is, and the way I've phrased it in this little bullet point, is the belief that they only accepted the Pentateuch, and I questioned that. I put that is dubious. And I'll tell you the reason why I did that, and that is because there is this common belief that the Sadducees would only accept the first 5 books of the Old Testament, that is, the writings of Moses, and that was it. And everything else, they just kind of discounted. That they didn't believe that that was authoritative, that it didn't come from God or anything like that. Well, and I held that opinion up until about maybe a month ago when I was studying this. And you'll see that even in Farrell's notes. On page 21, he even makes the same observation. And that is what is a common misunderstanding. And when you begin to dig deeper, and some of the scholarship that I did actually cite about all of this, the ones who are, I guess you could say, up to date in this particular debate, they have made the observation that this was a common misunderstanding, that it is a common misunderstanding ever since the days of the early church fathers Jerome and Origen. And the reason why is because they apparently misread Josephus, who wrote that the Sadducees, and I'm quoting him now, were guilty of receiving only the books of Moses. And what Jerome and Origen did is they interpreted that to mean the Pentateuch. And hence that misunderstanding has been passed on down to the modern day. But those who have studied, particularly the Sadducees in light of Josephus' writings, have concluded that Josephus, who, by the way, had absolutely no affinity for the Sadducees, in fact, he had a very low opinion of the Sadducees, there is nowhere stated in any of his writings that the Sadducees rejected the Hebrew canon. But he does talk about them rejecting the traditions of the Pharisees. That is, the oral tradition that the Pharisees held so dear, and was the reason why the Pharisees and the Sadducees were frequently at odds with one another. And so, therefore, there is the conclusion that Jerome and Origen simply misread Josephus' statement, or they misinterpreted it as being, when it said that they only look at the writings of Moses, that in their mind, that meant they only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Well, again, that's something that really Josephus doesn't do. He nowhere says anywhere that they rejected the rest of the Hebrew Old Testament canon. All he does is he points out, and again, you have to understand that he did not have any kind of affinity for the Sadducees, but he doesn't speak disparagingly of them with respect to the canon itself. Now, that's the most recent scholarship. So, Dan? Yes, that Moses was, in essence, the author of the Old Testament. In other words, that he is the one who governed it. And it's kind of a thing that the scholarship is really kind of complicated, but when you look at it, it's easy to understand. Now, they use all kinds of big words and things of that nature, but it's easy to understand when you do that kind of deep digging, like these guys apparently do, why it would be that they would have come to the understanding that they simply rejected it. Now, I will say this. There was a group that did, in fact, reject all of it, except for the first 5 books, and that was the Samaritans. And that is stated within other extant pieces of literature of the time that is not recorded in the Bible. So the Samaritans did only accept the first 5 books of the Bible, of the Old Testament. So again, you can look into that and you can come to any kind of conclusion you want to, I suppose. It really doesn't matter one way or the other. But the conclusion that I've come to is that it's dubious. I'm not saying that it's not true particularly, but it's questionable whether or not that particular opinion is true. Okay, so some of the other unique beliefs. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
It's like if we did that, if we had some members of the church who only accepted the Old Testament, and some who were like, well, we think the New Testament's pretty important too. Like,
yeah. Well, interestingly enough, when you talk about something like that, that actually happened during the period of the Reformation. Because Luther kicked the book of James out. He said it was not inspired of God. And it was because it went against his particular understanding of things. The book of Hebrews, for the longest time, wasn't accepted as canon because nobody knows who wrote it. Nobody has an idea who wrote it. I mean, they have ideas, but you can't prove it one way or the other. Even the book of Revelation, the whole book of Revelation was considered spurious for the longest time. And so the debate on canon has always been around, not only within Christian context, but also within Jewish context. And again, it's a very deep dive, it's a very deep read, but it's interesting to read about this kind of stuff as to why or how they came to the conclusions that they came to. And again, I would suggest that if you really are interested in that, to take that dive, because it's really interesting if you like that kind of stuff, that is. It's really quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. The other sects of Jewish culture still remain as highly based as they were, rather than being so diametrically opposed from other groups.
Yeah.
That would have been more difficult to explain.
Yeah. Yeah, and when you get into the dynamic of how these groups interacted with one another, again, there's a lot of history about that kind of stuff that obviously we don't have time to cover. But it really is kind of interesting. And the Pharisees and Sadducees did have conflict constantly. Which is, it's kind of ironic because when you look to see when it came to Jesus, well, they were on the same page there, but for vastly different reasons. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through this too as well. But anyway, some of the other things, they believed in absolute free will. And what I mean by that is that the Pharisees, they had this concept of fate and free will, and they kept it in tension. So they really had a hard time trying to explain how everything could be kind of based upon a deterministic way of approaching things, that everything had been planned out by God and all this kind of stuff, and then harmonize free will. And it's the same debate that Calvinists and Arminians have today. So it's kind of a thing that was held in tension. Whereas the Sadducees, they just believed in total absolute free will, which I think that I would fall in that category, because I do believe that human beings have absolute free will as well. But that's another interesting belief that they had in kind of distinction between them and the Pharisees. Another thing, and the New Testament points this out over in Acts chapter 23 and verse 8, they did not believe in a resurrection, they did not believe in angels, and they did not believe in spirits. And so what that introduces to us is the idea that they were a much more materialistic group of people than were the Pharisees. And it's also been noted that the Sadducees were much more liberal than the Pharisees when it came to following or came to forming definitive conclusions concerning rules that human beings were to follow. So they would have been more of the relativists of their day. Kind of like, I don't want to equate it with postmodern way of thinking today, but it would be similar, I think, in the sense that they would say you cannot make absolute rules based upon statements that have a tendency to be somewhat ambiguous or not clearly just stating a fact. And so therefore, they would have been much more likely to not form any kind of a conclusion, or at least to debate it, as opposed to the Pharisees, who had these oral traditions for the purpose of telling people how to act and how to live based upon their understanding of the Old Testament scriptures. So again, quoting from Braun, he said that the Pharisees emphasized knowing and obeying their massive collection of commandments and traditions, while the Sadducees preferred keeping such rules to a minimum. As the Pharisees accumulated and codified the teachings of their elders, the traditions grew. The Sadducees, however, were more likely to dispute with their teachers and to arrive at fewer firmly fixed convictions. So that, I think, is just a way of how they were thinking, the process by which they thought. And so that comes to their presence in the New Testament itself. And unlike the Pharisees, we don't run across the Sadducees near as often in the pages of the New Testament. But when we do, they usually are associated with the Pharisees, which, when you think about their differences and the animosity that existed between these two groups, it's really kind of surprising. And so if you look the word Sadducee up in a concordance, and then you look to the verse in which that concordance is pointing you, you will also see Pharisees are there, usually. So they were always associated with one another. And what this illustrates then is that, like the Pharisees, the Sadducees also perceived Jesus to be dangerous, but for a vastly different reason. The Pharisees considered Jesus dangerous because they believed that he was misleading the people, encouraging them to actually depart from the law of Moses, and particularly their understanding of what it meant to be a faithful Jew by following the traditions that they had placed around the law. And so that's why they thought Jesus is dangerous. The Sadducees, on the other hand, considered Jesus dangerous because they feared he was going to start a revolution. And by starting a revolution, that would bring down the wrath of Rome, and it would bring to an end their power and their cushy lifestyle. And so it was a much more materialistic dislike that they had for Jesus than the Pharisees did. Pharisees was much more theological, whereas the Sadducees was much more pragmatic. Okay, so to sum it all up, and I think Farrell makes a note of this on page 21 of the book, he points out that the Sadducees were an aristocratic class that, we might add, were primarily interested in getting along with the Gentiles, that is, the Romans at this particular time. And they did so in order to maintain their political power and their social status that they had grown accustomed to. And as Farrell pointed out, they would have been considered the religious liberals of the day. Okay, so that's the Sadducees. Anybody have any thoughts or any questions that you might have about that we can answer with maybe 30 seconds? Okay, well, let's get into this next group then. And you can see it's a bunch of them. The Essenes, the Zealots, the Herodians, the Samaritans, and then underneath them I have the scribes, the Sanhedrin, and the tax collectors, kind of following Farrell's, his outline that he has there. But what I've done is I've divided it up into two different kinds of groups. There are the groups that are identified by their ethnicity or their religio-political ideologies, and then the groups that could be identified by their professions and their social positions. So we're first going to be looking at the first four groups that are up there, which are identified either by their religio, their socio-political ideologies, or their ethnicity. And the first group we're going to talk about are the Essenes. So, on question number 1, I ask you, who were the Essenes and what were some of their identifying characteristics? Who were the Essenes? You read about them in the New Testament? Nowhere. They're not found in the New Testament. Okay, so let me make that observation first of all. Most of what we know about this group comes primarily from the writings of Josephus. And you might remember when we were talking about the Maccabean revolt, that what happened was that there were these groups of pious Jews, the part of the Hasidim or the Hasidians, and their legacy was the Pharisees, but their legacy was this group that was known as the Essenes. And we learn that from the writings of Josephus, who, by the way, actually lived among the Essenes for about 4 or 5 years of his young life. And so he was very favorable toward them. But then there are other writers like Philo of Alexandria and the Roman historian Pliny, who also talks about the Essenes. And ever since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls near the ruins of Qumran, which is on the west side of the Dead Sea in the late 1940s, this group came into greater focus because the description of the community in Qumran, as it was read in these scrolls that they found, was remarkably similar to the descriptions of the Essenes that were given by Josephus and by Philo and by Pliny. And so they are of particular interest for New Testament studies, primarily because there are some scholars who suggest that due to their ascetic lifestyle, John the Baptist may have in fact been one of them, as well as some suggesting that the early church may have been influenced by their lifestyle. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that in a minute. As far as their origin is concerned, their origin is still under debate. And it's been going on for a long time, particularly ever since the 1940s when they discovered these scrolls. But most have come to the conclusion that the seeds of this group were planted during or just before the rise of the Maccabean ruler Jonathan. And you remember how it was Mattathias who was the priest that started it. Simon then Judas took over. And then Jonathan was the next one in line, and then Simon was the last of the Maccabees. So Jonathan is in between Simon and Judas. And it was during Jonathan's period of time that it is believed that these Essenes developed, because what was an extreme position that he took, where he was trying to do the best he could to kind of get along with the Greeks. And they took this extreme position combating what they believed was the willingness of the Jewish leaders to weaken the requirements of the law of Moses, along with compromises in order to be able to accommodate the Greek influence. And we talked about that in lesson number 4. So there appears to be no question, at least among those who've studied where they came from, that like the Pharisees, they were a spin-off of this group known as the Hasidim, the pious ones. So that would be what is believed to be their origin, that they would have developed during this intertestamental period of time. Okay, now some of their identifying characteristics. First of all, they were a separatist group. And when I say separatist, I don't mean like the Pharisees. I mean they were a separatist group in that they went off and lived in isolated places. They stayed away from populated areas. They stayed away from other Jews whom they considered to be impious. And thus, the view that the community at Qumran was an Essene community, because that's the way the people of Qumran were known to live. The primary trait, though, was their asceticism. They were known for their communal living. They were also known for their communal ownership of property. And that has caused some to conclude that the early church was influenced by them. Because when you look into Acts chapter 2, verses 44 and 45 in particular, it talks about how that these new Christians had everything in common, and nobody said anything was of their own. And so it is believed that that particular lifestyle that was chosen by the early church was very much like the Essenes. And so that's why some have concluded that the early church people would have been influenced by the Essenes in their asceticism. It is also because of their isolationist practices and their asceticism that some have concluded that John the Baptist may have been one of them. Because when you read about him in Matthew 3, verses 1 through 4, he's a guy that lived off in the wilderness by himself. He just ate whatever was there. And that's the way the Essene communities were. And so some have suggested that he may have been an Essene. Again, there's no way of proving that one way or the other. But it is interesting that John, who lived an ascetic lifestyle, was very similar to the way the Essenes would have been. And one of the things that I found interesting is that they did not come right out and condemn marriage, but they preferred to avoid it. And the reason why is because they did not consider the marital relationship to be necessarily holy because of the sexual aspect of it. But they also recognized that, I think what most people eventually come to recognize, that that's the only way you can propagate the race. And so therefore, they did marry out of necessity for the sake of posterity, but they did not do it for pleasure. And I think that that's an interesting point about the Essenes, that they were a people who did not consider marriage to be a good relationship, that they therefore preferred to stay away from it. And that's probably one of the reasons why it is that they didn't last very long, because, I mean, after all, how are you going to continue to propagate your belief system if you're not raising children to have that belief system? Unless you just go out and convert people, and they weren't doing that because they isolated themselves from everybody. Okay, that's the Essenes. Now, well, it could be that some of them had been converted by John the Baptist, or at least been disciples of John the Baptist, who then led them to Jesus. So that's at least, that's some scenarios that some people have painted. Okay, now the Zealots, they're an interesting group. The only time that they are mentioned as far as their presence in the New Testament is concerned is in the list of Jesus' disciples when he chose his apostles. And of course, the only time it's mentioned is in Matthew chapter 10, Mark 3, Luke 6, and Acts chapter 1. And it talks about Simon. Simon, who is called the Zealot. Now, it's interesting to note that if you use the King James or the New King James Version, they call him a Canaanite. And that is translated from the Aramaic word Canaan, which means zealot, and not Canaanite. And so therefore, the King James Version and the New King James is just totally inaccurate by translating the word Canaanean as Canaanite, because that's not what the word means. The word means zealot. It's an Aramaic word that means zealot. Okay, so that's just for, if you're ever in a Bible Trivial Pursuit game and you get that question, which I've played a bunch of them, I've never seen that question come up. But if it ever does, now you know the answer to that question. Okay, as far as their origin is concerned, according to Josephus, this group is believed to have originated in 6 AD with a guy by the name of Judas the Galilean, who Josephus calls him the son of the arch-robber Hezekiah, who had been subdued by King Herod. So, obviously, he's got somewhat of a shady background. His dad was an arch-robber. He was a criminal. Okay, now according to Josephus, what this Judas did, this Judas the Galilean, he accused his countrymen of being cowards if they continued paying taxes to the Romans and submitting to what he called the mortal men as if they were lords. And that's taken from Josephus' work on the wars. This group has been recognized as the ideological heirs of the Maccabeans, who were fiercely loyal to Jewish traditions, certainly for religious reasons, but more so for nationalistic reasons. And a group that was a part of the Zealots that was known as the Sicarii, which Farrell does mention, these were a group that would be characterized today as terrorists. And what they would do is they carried a little dagger in their robes because they could hide them. And what they would do is they would go up and they would actually assassinate innocent people, innocent Jews who were loyal to Rome by stabbing them to death. So the Sicarii were a part of the Zealots, and they didn't want Jews to have anything to do with Rome, and if they found anybody who was vulnerable, they may in fact just take them out. So they would have been the terrorists of their day. Some of the identifying characteristics that I thought was interesting is the fact that, first of all, they agreed, for the most part, with the Pharisees' religious position. But they also, and again I'm quoting Braun here, said they possessed an inviolable attachment to liberty. And that's quoting from Josephus, calling only God their ruler and Lord, and they had no fear of death or of any human rulers. And he went on to say that opposition to Rome and other foreign oppressors remained mostly theoretical among the Pharisees and many of the people of the land. But the Zealots, he said, translated their opposition into action by occasional raids and attacks upon the Romans. Josephus had no respect for this group. In fact, in his writings, he absolutely detested the Zealots, and he blamed them for the ones who started the Jewish revolt against Rome that ultimately led to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So Josephus cared nothing for these people and blamed them for Israel's final destruction because of their nationalistic way in which they approached everything. Okay, so that's a little bit about the Zealots. Now, the Herodians are the next ones in line, and the Herodians are only found in 3 places in the New Testament, and they're always teamed together with the Pharisees in opposition to Jesus. And their teaming up with the Pharisees is extremely ironic, especially when you begin to learn a little bit more about the Herodians. Their origin goes back to the 1st century BC. They are recognized actually as a subcategory of the Sadducees, who cast their lots with Herod the Great and who continued to support the Herodian dynasty. And being from the group of Sadducees, they were of the priestly aristocracy and the affluent society within Jewish culture of the time, and they did everything they could to protect their power and their comfortable status. And so basically their identifying beliefs or their identifying characteristics would be, first of all, that they agreed with the Sadducees both politically and religiously. The only major real difference would have been that unlike the majority of the Sadducees who did have some allegiance to a religious value system, the Herodians had none. As Pharaoh pointed out, they were wholly politically minded. That's all they cared about was politics and keeping their position secure. And the way they did that is they wrapped themselves around the Herodians in order to be able to maintain any kind of power structure. So that's pretty much what we know about them. So when you see the Herodians mentioned in the scriptures, with the Pharisees in particular, you can see how, man, they must have really hated Jesus to come to the positions that they did. Okay, and then the last one that we're probably going to get through tonight is the Samaritans. The Samaritans, as far as their presence in the New Testament is concerned, they're not spoken of a great deal. And when they are spoken of, it's clear that the Jews and the Samaritans didn't think much of one another. Like, for instance, in Luke chapter 9, you remember when Jesus was going through the Samaritan village and they rejected him, and I think it was James and John said, let's call down lightning from heaven and destroy him. And Jesus just, he told them, no, we're not going to do that. They didn't know what they were talking about. Well, that was a Samaritan village. In John 4, the Samaritan woman at the well, she even said Jews don't have anything to do with Samaritans. And then I think it's interesting in John chapter 8, verse 48, when the Pharisees were confronting Jesus, one of the things that they said about him is they said, you must be a Samaritan or you have a demon. I mean, that's how, they just used it as kind of a byword. So they really didn't like the Samaritans at all. They considered them a mongrel race of people lower than the Gentiles. Their origin actually goes back way before the intertestamental period of time. It goes back to the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians back in 722 BC. And as was the practice of the Assyrians, and the Babylonians did the same thing, when they conquered a people, they would transport them to different areas outside of their own land and replace them with other conquered peoples from the other lands. And so the foreigners, which were Gentiles from the other lands, were transported to the area previously controlled by the northern kingdom of Israel, which was known as Samaria. And over time, what happened is they began to intermarry with the Jews, and the fruit of those marriages came to be known as Samaritans. And ever since that time, there was always tension between the Jews and the Samaritans. When Dan was studying with us in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, they wanted to join in with them when they were building the temple, and they said, no, Joshua and Zerubbabel said, we're having nothing to do with you. Well, that only created even more problems. So they didn't like one another. And primarily their identifying characteristics is that they were similar to the Jews in their beliefs, but they also had major differences. They recognized the Pentateuch as sacred text, but they only accepted Moses as God's prophet. And in fact, all of the other prophets that were sent by God were considered to be revolutionaries by the Samaritans. They obviously rejected the oral traditions of the Pharisees. And as this relates to the intertestamental period of time, what is interesting is that the Samaritans had their own temple, which was located on Mount Gerizim, where they believed Abraham bound Isaac for sacrificing, and where Jacob had his dream of heaven. But this temple was later destroyed by John Hyrcanus in 128 BC, which added more animosity between the two groups, because he went in and destroyed their temple. And my understanding is their temple was just as ornate as the temple that was in the city of Jerusalem. So you can see why they didn't get along with one another. And they really had conflicts with each other. Okay, the rest of these groups, we're not going to have much time. I will say to you, the scribes would be the modern day lawyers. They weren't a religious group. This was their position. They would have been the modern day lawyers. Most of them would have been Pharisees. When it comes to the Sanhedrin, that was like the Supreme Court, the Jewish Supreme Court. And when it came to tax collectors, well, nobody likes a tax collector. Not even today. And one of the great ironies is, here's Simon the Zealot and Matthew, a tax collector, who's part of the apostles. Okay, I'm going to conclude with what Paul said in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. That in the fullness of time, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law. And when we look at the intertestamental period of time, we should be able to be, I hope, impressed with the changes that the peoples and the events of that time brought to the Judean area and the surrounding area of Palestine. But not simply to be impressed with the history or to be impressed with the people or to even be impressed with their literature, but more so to be impressed with God and how He was working during this period of time, bringing about the fullness of time. And as we then see, when we get to the New Testament period of time, the world was at peace. They could travel anywhere they wanted to. They had all of these favorable circumstances with respect to the language, the Greek language, and it made it very easy for the launching of Christianity from Judea into the larger Mediterranean world and then throughout the rest of the world. So in the fullness of time, and what we're seeing is the completeness of that in this intertestamental period of time. So I hope this study's been helpful for you all. I've enjoyed it, and I hope that it's been at least informative to you all as well. Thank you all for your participation tonight.